Hi, I'm Ron Cole, and in this tutorial, I'd like to show you how I'm going to make an UltraCal 30 plaster mold from this creature sculpture. That mold will later be used to cast a foam latex stop-motion animation puppet. Now, before I talk about making the mold itself, I'd like to point out a few things about the sculpture itself that's relevant to mold making. First of all, you've probably already noticed he doesn't have a head, and that's just because of the design. The head of this creature comes out of the front of the body in a way that would make the mold making more complicated. So rather than go through that, I sculpted the head separately, and it'll be attached later as part of the puppet. The clay that I sculpted this with is a very hard clay. This brand of clay is Chavant clay. They're hard variety. It's quite hard. And using the hard clay has two advantages. One is just in sculpting, you can achieve a much finer detail in the surface. And for the purpose of molding, having a hard clay to work with is really good, because when you make a mold, you need to build a clay wall that completely surrounds the contour of your sculpt so that you can lay plaster up just on one half. And that means you've got a tool all around the edge of the character and hopefully not damage it. So the harder the clay is, the more likely it is that you're not going to be denting things accidentally. And the last thing I'd like to point out, as you might notice, if we can get him against the background here, is that he is sculpted up on top of these two posts that come directly out of the bottom of his feet. And that's important for the casting stage, because for a stop-motion animation character, the foam rubber has to be poured into the mold and then a metal skeleton put inside of the mold. And that metal skeleton needs to be registered inside that mold in a way that all of the parts of it fit, including the little wires that go into the fingers, need to be right where they need to be in the mold and not be able to shift around. So these posts will leave an impression in the mold that will enable me to put screws up through the bottom of the mold into the feet of that metal armature, securing it in place really firmly so it's not going to rock around or touch the surface of the mold on the inside. So, I can talk about building the wall around the character. You need to use a different type of clay, pretty much the opposite of what I told you before. This clay is called clean clay. It's a very soft, it's a very inert clay in the sense that it's not going to interfere with any kind of chemicals that you would use to make any sort of mold. So it's good for making silicone molds and that sort of thing. And for making the wall around the clay character, what I'll do is I'll make myself a big sheet of the clean clay and roll it out with a rolling pin, and then I can take a hobby knife and just carve off individual strips like this, and then I can place them on the sculpture and press them down into the details on the surface. Of course, you're going to have little gaps that you can't quite get into by pressing, but for the most part, over areas on the surface, like down the length of the arm, just pressing it in really firmly should push down into the skin textures and the pores and that sort of thing, and require minor tooling to make sure it's a nice clean line. It's got to be a nice clean line. And I'll show that to you later after the wall is laid up. But before I can start laying up the wall of clay, the first thing that I have to do is build a support structure, which I've already done. Not really build it, but sculpt it. It's made out of more of the same clean clay, and I did that in advance. And I've got 3 sections that fit right in place around the sculpture that come close to the surface but don't touch it. And that's necessary because when you're trying to lay up the clay wall along like the bottoms of the arms or in between the legs, the clay wants to fall away naturally because it's heavy and you're not really sculpting it as a permanent part of the sculpture. You just need it to be loosely attached so that, it acts as a barrier for the plaster. And so once this support wall is in place, you're then able to take your thinner strips of clay, and you've got a base there for it to just hang on. And so I'll start doing that, and I think I'll show you some clips here of this in process. So you don't have to be sit and watch me do the whole thing for the hours that it takes, because you really have to be meticulous and careful about making sure that under the armpits, in between the legs, in between the wrinkles on the skin, you've really got to get that sealed, because when you lay up the plaster, you don't want any of the plaster leaking through to the opposite side. Whenever I need to fit a strip of clay into an area on the sculpture that has a very distinct contour that I just can't press into, what I like to do is put the clay onto the wall right next to the sculpture and then approximately trace the outline that I need to get into with a hobby knife into the clay like I would using a pencil. Then bring it down onto my table where I can cut it cleanly without having to worry about accidentally cutting the sculpture or bumping into the sculpture. And I can take that piece and put it back into place, and hopefully it's enough of a good puzzle piece to be able to just work it into with by pressing. And then after that comes the real work of sealing up that edge. I take my sculpture tools and work it into every little pore and every little line of texture in the sculpture. And in the end, what you want is a nice clean line between your sculpture and your separation wall. And this is what it looks like when your clay dividing wall is completed. There are a couple of things I've added here that I didn't mention when I first started making it that I want you to notice. There's this clay outline here, which just simply defines the outline that the plaster mold will have. There's no reason to fill in this whole outer section here unless you feel like wasting some plaster, which is fine by me. And also, and more importantly, are these half-round shapes that I've placed periodically around the flat surface. I don't put them on any part that's angled because I don't want the two halves of the mold to get locked together, but these bumps will help to register the two halves of the mold perfectly together, because the half-round shape on this part will fit inside of the impression that'll be left on the second half, and that'll ensure that the two halves line up perfectly. For that, personally, I like to use these. These are acrylic half spheres. It doesn't have to be acrylic half spheres. I just like these because they're easy to use. If you don't have them, you could use whole plastic balls or metal balls. Just make sure that when you press them into the surface, they go at least halfway in, preferably a little further than halfway in, because you don't want them to be a permanent part of the plaster mold. Once the plaster would grab onto that ball if it's sticking out a little bit too far. That wouldn't be a tragedy either. So if that happened, okay, it'll just become the ball on the negative side. So that's pretty much, the nice thing about this is you only got to do this for the first half of the mold. Second half of the mold will already have the impression of this wall left behind for you to do the next piece. So again, you only have to do this one time. So that'll do it for this segment, and in the next segment we'll start getting some plaster on this guy and get the first half of the mold done. Hi, I'm Ron Cole, and this is part 2 of my tutorial on how to make plaster molds for casting rubber parts. And before I begin mixing any plaster, I want to show you all of the things that you're going to need ahead of time to get started. The first thing that you're going to need is a material for embedding into the plaster, just to strengthen it up a little bit more to prevent cracks from turning into a disaster should they ever happen. My favorite material to use for that is burlap. Burlap is very absorbent and very flexible when you have it mixed into the plaster, and you can take little swatches of it and put it all over the sculpture. And I cut all my burlap up ahead of time. I cut it up into many, many, many little swatches, more than I know I'll need because I don't want to run out while making the mold. And that, little swatches like this will bend around shapes without buckling, and you can jigsaw puzzle them together. And the next thing you're going to need is a collection of mixing buckets. And again, just like the burlap, you want more of these than you think you're going to need ahead of time. And then after that, you're going to need a collection of a variety of sizes of brushes. Not good artist brushes. Plaster will definitely mess them up. And one thing I want to point out to you about these brushes is the texture. I like to use brushes that are not too firm and not too soft. The reason why is because you want to be able to scoop up plaster and stick it into the little nooks and crannies where you need it to be without your bristles wilting. And you don't want it too firm either because you're working on clay and you don't want to be stabbing marks into it with a throwaway brush that have stiff bristles. Now, of course, you can't make a plaster mold at all without this. A big old bag of plaster. This is UltraCal 30 plaster. Best darn plaster for making a mold there is. You can make plaster molds with other types of plasters. You can use HydroCal, you can use casting plasters, you can even use plaster of Paris. But this stuff's the best for a couple of reasons. One, incredibly strong. It's pretty much stone when it's finished, and that means you're going to be able to get a number of good castings out of your mold when it's done before you ever start to lose any surface from it. And the other reason why it's a great mold making plaster is because of the setup time. UltraCal has a good long working times, anywhere between a half an hour to an hour before it starts to become too thick for you to be using. And that is ideal because that gives you all the time that you will need to get the plaster everywhere you need to get it, do all your burlap dipping and get it where you want it without having to rush or in a panic. And the last thing that I'm going to recommend you have on hand is a big old bucket of water. And the reason why you need the bucket of water is not for mixing your plaster. It's actually for cleaning your brushes and your mixing bowls while you're working. And I'll explain by the end of this tutorial how to get rid of your excess used dirty plaster water, but I'll just tell you right now, the one thing you don't want to do is pour it down your sink. You don't want to clean your brushes in the sink. You don't want to go down the drain. You'll have a plumbing problem that you won't want to deal with, but there is a good way of getting rid of it, and I promise before the end of this video I'll show you what that is. And so having said all that, we're just about ready to start mixing up some plaster, and I've already measured out the amount of water that I want for my first batch. It's going to be a relatively small batch. The first coat of plaster, and maybe even the second coat, it all depends upon how much coverage I get from the first batch. The first batch is, in a sense, the most important batch because that's the batch that will reproduce all of your surface details, and you need to be very careful in how you apply it because you want to avoid missing spots that will end up just being gaps in your mold. And we'll get to that right after I mix up some plaster, which I'm ready to start doing right now. When you begin adding your plaster to your water, it's important to sprinkle it in gradually until you've built up a mountain rising up out of the top of the water, and then you just let it sit and completely absorb the water until you can see that the plaster is fully saturated. After that, then just stirring it briefly with like a paint stirrer will get it completely blended. When you start adding the plaster, your first layer to your sculpture, you brush into any deep details and along straight lines, in between, wrinkles in your character or whatever, all the deepest spots, but you go into them with a very thin layer to be sure that you're not trapping pockets of air. At that point, your plaster should start to thicken up, and you can move to a bigger brush, adding on thicker layers. You'll probably do this in a couple of batches of plaster, and as one thing you'll notice is that when you start adding newer batches of plaster to older batches, the newer ones will set up more quickly. And you can start adding your burlap. I usually just dip it in and scrape the excess off, and like bandages, just lay them over the surface until you've got a whole patchwork over the entire surface. You'll notice that as you dip the patches of burlap in, a lot of the material falls off into the plaster, but that becomes useful. You pull out the loose strands later to stuff into places that are hard to get into, like armpits and between the legs and corners of the mold. Okay, and now I'm starting to finalize the mold, thickening up any areas that appear too thin, filling in any gaps that I find, and in general just smoothing out the entire surface of the mold and making it a bit more easy to handle and attractive and evenly thick. At that point, all there is left to do is just continue to add batches of plaster until you've reached half an inch to an inch in thickness over the entire surface of the mold. And all of my layers, I only added 2 more layers after the burlap layer, and I'm up to my favorite part, because after all the brushing is done with my hands a little bit wet, you get to polish the surface out to a nice shine, smooth out all your edges, and that will just about do it for this half of the mold. And in the next segment, I'll show you how to break him out of his clay barrier on the back and get to work on doing the other half. Hi, this is part 3 of my mold making tutorial, and I'm Ron Cole, and in this part we're going to be trying to get this mold finished. The first thing I'm going to need to do is remove all of the clay and support structure that I placed around the sculpture in step 1. Well, one thing I want to point out before I start removing that clay is that this mold that I created in step 2 has been sitting for an entire 24 hours. And whenever possible, I like to let the plaster just cure for 24 hours before starting to make the second half, and that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, of course, the plaster can reach its maximum strength, but actually, it's actually to make things easier, because plaster heats up considerably while it's curing, and so all of the clay that you create that wall with gets very sticky, and you need to clean it all off. And unless you allow the mold to completely cure and cool before doing that, it's going to be very sticky. So I'm going to start removing that clay from the back half, and I just really need to peel it off, but I've got a collection of my fine sculpting tools that I'll be using to scrape off whatever tiny bits, and I've also got a paintbrush and a bottle of rubbing alcohol, because I know that there's going to be little smears of clay and little spots that I need to brush it out of. I wouldn't use anything stronger in terms of a solvent than rubbing alcohol, because any solvent that gets onto your sculpture is going to soften up that clay and kind of flatten out the details. So now you don't need to be here for the entire boring cleanup process, but I just want to start removing this clay so you can see that when you peel off the clay, what you've got is a nice reproduction. Your little half spheres should just pop right out with the clay. And just be cautious not to damage your sculpture while you remove the rest of the clay dividing wall. During my cleanup process, when I find smears of clay caught along the surface details or along the seam line, just pull it off with a sculpture tool, and then usually I can just brush it away. Now, after having removed the clay, unfortunately, I've discovered that I've accidentally trapped some air pockets where I don't want them, but that's almost a good thing for you, so you can see how to deal with that if you get them. All I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the air pockets with some more plaster that I'll mix up, but it's actually very important before adding more plaster into a little air bubble to actually moisten it with water first, because if you try to take new plaster and add it on top of already cured plaster, it's going to cure almost instantly, and so it won't bond very well. So you need to moisten that area first with water so that it'll cure at a much slower rate and be able to seep into the surface. And after that sets up, you'll be able to smooth it off. Okay, the mold has been cleaned, and whatever little air bubbles I found have been patched with a little bit of more plaster, and I'm ready for my next step. And my next step is to take some more thin sheets of clean clay. These, you might notice, I've angled on this edge, and that edge will be pointed in toward the sculpture. I'm going to add a thin line of clean clay all the way around the outer perimeter of the mold, leaving about a half an inch of space between this new line of clean clay and the sculpture. And I'll secure that, and also I'll make sure never to cover up any of these impressions left by the half rounds. Those are called mold keys, by the way, so if you ever hear that term, mold keys, that's what it means. And here's what that completed clay barrier looks like. I can spin it around here a little bit for you to give you a better look at the dimensions of it. And once again, I've avoided covering up any of my little mold keys. And also this outer barrier here, including this little well that I build at the bottom that goes down to the board, that's just to define the edge of the mold and keep it nice and flat. It's purely for the aesthetics. If you don't want to bother making this outer wall, the edges of your mold will be rough. You could file them off later. It's not a big deal. The last thing that I'll need to do before mixing up plaster to do my next layer is to take some petroleum jelly, and I need to cover up every bit of the exposed plaster in here. The clay wall, the sculpture, they don't need any. But the plaster most definitely does. That's what ensures that the two halves of the mold are going to come apart, because if there's no petroleum jelly or other type of mold release agent, they will not come apart. So very important. And after I add this release agent, I'll mix up plaster, and every step in making the second half of the mold is exactly the same as it is in the first half of the mold. So there's no reason for me to show you that part of it. The next thing you'll see in this is when this puppy is done and I open the finished mold. Once the second half of the mold has been completed, it's important to open the two halves evenly and slowly to avoid any cracking. I like to do that by adding stacks of popsicle sticks all around the edge, adding new sticks into the stacks and tapping them in, and gradually opening it. And as you do that, you'll feel it start to loosen up. After it feels loose enough to pull apart, take all those sticks out of there and start giving it a good yank. The detail surface on a new mold can be somewhat delicate, so use care when removing the original sculpture. And once you've managed to wrestle all of your clay out of your mold and get it nice and cleaned up, I had some sharp edges on here, which I just took a good strong knife and cleaned up the edges a little bit, just so your fingers are not getting cut up by sharp edges. You'll notice that there is a gap all along the edge here that's supposed to be there. I always like to have that so I can get some tools or fingers or whatever in there to be able to pry the mold apart. And if we can take a look at the inside, the most important part of your mold, you can see I'm really happy with the way this came out. I got nice reproduction on the detail, not too many little air bubbles. Something I also should have mentioned earlier is that when you need to fill little air bubbles that you might get in your mold, 5-minute liquid 5-minute epoxy resin or 20-minute epoxy resin dropped into the holes, that works really well too, because that adheres really well to the plaster surface and doesn't interfere with anything that you might cast into the mold. So you might want to consider that. So that's it. But I didn't forget. Got to tell you how to get rid of that plaster bucket. What you're going to do is you're going to take that bucket and do absolutely nothing with it for a couple days. All right, and just let the slimy sludge in the bucket all settle down till it's just a white mass on the bottom, and you can see clear water on the top. That is safe enough to drain down your sink, but only the clear water part. Once you see the white stuff start to drain out of the bucket, thing to do at that point is just take that bucket and set it aside. And whether it takes a week or a month, you just let that sucker evaporate until there's just nothing but dried up crumbly plaster at the bottom. Knock that off into your garbage can and get rid of it that way. And other than that, I think we are done here. So I hope the tutorial was helpful, and happy mold making in your future, and cheers.